In this video, we're going to give a justification for why we're not allowed to divide by 0. So if you remember, for our properties of real numbers, we had this property that said that every number out there, except for 0, has a multiplicative inverse. So let's just recap on what that means. So what that means is that for every number that you pick in the real number system, so anything you want, let's say I pick the number 3, then there should exist another number out there such that when you multiply them, you get the multiplicative identity, or 1. Okay, so the idea is any number has its very own multiplicative inverse, such that when you do multiply these things together, you get the multiplicative identity. Okay, so that's the deal, is that we're set up for our real numbers in such a way that you give me any number, multiply it by its multiplicative inverse, and I get 1 out. Now, again, we're saying that this any number can be any number except for 0. 0 is the unique one in the situation. We're going to see why. Okay. So what we do is we write this multiplicative inverse. We give it a special notation. We say that the inverse, the multiplicative inverse of 3, is just written like this, with 3 with a little negative 1 up on top, and that is kind of our uniform way of saying an inverse. So we do the same thing with functions and whatnot. So what we're saying is that this guy out there exists. Now we give it the value when we're working with the real numbers in terms of how we work with fractions. We give this thing a value of 1 over 3, or 1 over the number that we were looking at. And so that should be equal to 1. So sure enough, 1/3 is a real number. Okay, it can be written as a fraction. So it's definitely a rational number. Okay, and there we go. We're done. We found it. Let me give you another example. So what if we have something like 1/2? Well, then 1/2 times something out there should give me 1. So 1/2 times its multiplicative inverse should give me 1. Okay, so that means 1/2 times the multiplicative inverse of a half should be 1. Now, what is the number out there that when we multiply by a half gives us 1? But we know that that number is 2. And so this should make a little bit of sense also with your with when you work with exponents. Why we flip them when finding for the numbers. Why we just flip them in terms of finding their inverses. So this would be 1/2 times the number 2 and equals 1. Now here's where it becomes a little bit tricky. What about the number 0? So why do we say that we can use any number up here except 0? Okay, let's look at that. So what we would have to have is that 0 times its multiplicative inverse would have to equal 1. Well, we have this property of 0 where 0 times anything gives us 0. So this guy right here, we're not even allowed to define it in terms of our game, because in the rules and the structure of our game, this guy right here, 0 times something, has always got to give me 0. It can't give me 1. So this guy right here can't be defined. It's undefined in our game. We're not allowing it to exist in the game. Because if we did allow it to exist, then we'd have 0 times some other number out there being equal to 1. But again, we know that 0 times anything, any of the real numbers, gives us 0. That's one of the properties of 0. Okay, so now, what would this be? Well, if we wrote it out, it would be 0 with a negative 1 up top, right? If we allowed it to be defined. which we're not going to allow it. But if we did, this is what we get. Now, looking at the cases over here, we know that this should just be the reciprocal. So in other words, 0 times 1 over 0 should have to equal 1. So again, you can see here that we can't, because this thing can't be defined, this thing can't be defined either. So therefore, this is undefined because these can never actually be equal. And so it gives you a justification for why we're not allowing division by 0, because otherwise our properties that we've got set up wouldn't all work out. There'd be inconsistencies in terms of the game that we're playing. And so we want to make sure that we don't even allow whatever this object is, we don't even allow it to be in the game, because otherwise it will mess up this property of 0 times something being equal to a number other than 0. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Kind of gives you an argument for why we don't allow division by 0. There's lots of other more philosophical arguments, or you can look up online and see some other justifications for it. But this one right here is nice because it works with the axioms, that the rules that we've already talked about in terms of mathematics. And so so there you go. That's the little story here about why we're not allowing division by 0. Okay, let's go ahead and proceed.